Hello, my name is Kelly Doyle. This is a presentation on Azure BizTalk services for CSCIE-90 Cloud Computing at the Harvard Extension School. Without further ado, let's get started. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to briefly talk about the evolution of enterprise application integration and what are some attributes of EAI frameworks that make them what they are. We're going to do a brief introduction to Microsoft BizTalk and a demo of Windows Azure BizTalk services, which is BizTalk hosted in the cloud. So first of all, there's this concept of point-to-point service-oriented architecture, which the professor talked about in class. So people realize that it's easy to share application, business logic, and information between systems when we have this concept of web services, which involve data contracts and service contracts. And this is sort of a realistic scenario in organizations where we have different applications that are part of an order fulfillment scenario. We've got a legacy FTP EDI type scenario where people are dropping order files off to us, and these services are all hooked together point to point. The only downside with this is it's sort of a manageability issue, as the professor discussed, where the number of nodes that we're introducing into the service-oriented architecture increases the complexity of the system as we have all of these things talking to each other. So this brings us to enterprise application integration frameworks, such as BizTalk. These are frameworks which try to help us manage this. So a common framework and service bus gives us the concept of federation, which groups services behind centralized endpoints, mediation, which is a way to route messages using a service bus or some similar type of technology, and also traceability, a common view where we can view errors and diagnostics. And we're going to see that BizTalk in Azure provides us with all of these. BizTalk has been around for a while. It's traditionally been an on-premises application. There's other EAI frameworks from IBM and others, and they all generally work similarly, where we have this concept of one or more service buses, and it's the service bus's job to take incoming messages, whether they're messages that are coming through a SOAP endpoint or that are dropped into an FTP through EDI, and put them on the bus and figure out how to route them to consumers and translate the messages from one format to another as need be. So that helps solve some of our manageability concerns. What are the pros and cons of EAI frameworks? So it does give us that improved manageability. It lets us brag that we're using EAI frameworks, which is great. Some of the downsides are sticker shock for organizations. So there's an investment in software and hardware that needs to happen, and there's a steep learning curve, which means that often we need to hire consultants to help navigate us through this complex technology. So that brings us to EAI in the cloud. So what if there is a way to take this, the benefits of EAI frameworks, and run them in the cloud, leveraging the on-premises resources when necessary? And Microsoft calls this the hybrid cloud. So if we could do this, the pros would be reduced startup costs because we wouldn't have to outlay for the EAI software or hardware, and ease of deployment. The cons right now are that it's still relatively an immature framework. BizTalk is specifically. There's a dearth of documentation and experts for BizTalk in the cloud. It took, even to get the simple example that we're looking at here, it took quite a bit of research and work to get it working. So there is still, it does retain that learning curve, I found. So here's an example of what EAI in the cloud might look like. So now we have our service bus and we have our storefront, which is also hosted in the cloud, routing orders through the service bus to our order processing service. We've got an EAI facade, which is used to route messages to our credit card processors and shipping providers, and our corporate customers are maybe sending us large batches of orders that's processed through the service bus. But we still have some resources that are on premises that we haven't moved to the cloud yet for whatever reason, and in that case, BizTalk in the cloud can talk back to our components through our own service endpoints or through FTP files. So it's sort of a hybrid solution, which is really what organizations are going to need for the most part. They're still going to have some things running on premises. So let's talk a little bit about Windows Azure BizTalk services. So this extends the functionality of the BizTalk application server to the cloud for all the benefits that we already discussed. So the components of a BizTalk application are as follows. We have sources, and sources may include things like FTP folders where messages get dropped to. We have HTTP messages coming through an endpoint, and these messages get routed through a pipeline which is going to be managed by something called a bridge. So the messages conform to some schema, and our bridge is going to translate these messages, perhaps enrich the messages with additional information that's needed by the consumers, and it's going to route it to different destinations. So for Azure BizTalk, these destinations can include other web services. They could include blobs, so we could be writing the files to images, for example. We could be dropping them into an FTP folder, or we could be moving them to an Azure service bus. Okay, so we're going to do a quick walkthrough of building a Windows Azure BizTalk service application in Visual Studio. And it's going to be pretty simple. We're going to start off with an FTP source where we're going to drop messages. We're going to have a bridge that's going to route messages to an FTP destination. And after that, we'll extend that just a little bit. So the first step that we're going to need to do is install the prerequisites. Obviously, you're going to need an Azure account. The BizTalk SDK gives you the BizTalk project type in Visual Studio. PowerShell is necessary to run some of the command line activities that are needed to manage the BizTalk service, similar to what we had to do with the Amazon command line interfaces. In fact, as far as I can tell, there are some things that can only be done in PowerShell. You can't do it through the dashboard at all. There's also some sample BizTalk applications which we will reference to see how certain operations are performed. So the first real step is we need to add a new Azure BizTalk service. I have one set up, but I will show you where that is done. So when you've logged into your Azure dashboard, you can create new. You're going to want to custom create a new type of BizTalk service here of a developer type. The wizard will prompt you for additional information such as your location and where the database storage for this is going to live. In the interest of time, I already have a BizTalk service that I've created, so I will use that. So here we see defining the service. Once we have our service created, we need to authorize the BizTalk dashboard so that it can access our service. In order to do that, we will get the connection information from our BizTalk service, and we will enter that information in the management console, which will allow the management console to read the information about the service, which I've already done here. And we will be able to see our tracking information, which includes debugging information on the service, which you will need if you're going to set up anything with any complexity. Also, once the service is installed, it will create and associate an SSL certificate with the BizTalk service. You will want to download that and install it in your trusted root store in your development machine, and that will allow PowerShell to access the BizTalk service. So once you have those steps squared away, you can create a new BizTalk services project. In this case, this is a Visual Studio project. And again, I already have a Visual Studio project created, but I will show you how to do that. So once you have the the software installed, the BizTalk SDK in Visual Studio, then there will be a new project type available, and you'll be able to create a new BizTalk service. So in my case, I have a BizTalk service that I'm going to work off of. When you first create your BizTalk service, if you click on this design service of this BCS file, you'll see a location for BizTalk service URL. You'll enter the location of your URL there, and this will associate your project with your new BizTalk service that we had just created. So we're going to want to define a message schema. In this case, I defined a simple message called an alert, which has two properties, a type and details. Once you've defined your schema in BizTalk, you can right-click on the schema to generate instances, which I've used to generate two simple messages representing a type 1 message and a type 2 message. And we'll see why I did that in a bit. So we've created the test messages. We're going to want to define a message source now. So in my BizTalk application, I've created a FTP source, and I've pointed it to an FTP server that I have set up on a Windows machine in Amazon, just to show that I can connect outside of Azure and have a source that exists on a completely different network. So in this case, I have a folder for my in folder where I'm going to read messages from, and the bridge is going to route them to a folder which happens to be on the same machine but could be anywhere else, where I'm going to write messages based on the type of message. In this case, it's routing all type 2 messages there. So again, we talked about the bridge. The bridge contains a runtime address, which we can also use to send messages directly to the bridge. Functions of the bridge include validating the messages, routing them based on type or some other information, transforming the messages, or enriching data such as adding properties that the consumers might need. So now we can deploy and test the BizTalk application. And you'll notice there's no real code here. I've done everything through configuration and entering data. I can build my application, however. It will let me know if there's any errors. Once the application is built, then I can right-click to deploy the solution. My solution is currently set up to automatically start when I deploy the bridge. In this case, I already have my solution deployed to Azure, so it's currently running. So now I want to test my application. In order to test the application, I'm going to remote desktop to the location of the FTP server, where I have a couple of messages in a staging folder. I'm going to take one of my messages and move it to the in folder, which is currently empty, and BizTalk will write it to the out folder. So right now, the system will be polling. The Azure service will be polling this FTP location. It will detect the file, and it should move it in a minute or two. While that's happening, we'll take a quick look at PowerShell. So there are some commands in PowerShell. As I said, that my bridge is currently running automatically. I can run commands to stop the Azure bridge. I can remove instances of the bridge or individual artifacts of the bridge. So PowerShell is something that for any kind of debugging or extensive development activity, you're going to want to have these commands at your disposal and review what's capable. Okay, that being said, by now hopefully my message has been moved to the out folder, and it has. I can take a quick look at this message, see that it is indeed a type 2. BizTalk in Azure has routed my message successfully. Great. But it's kind of boring. We didn't really need BizTalk to move files from one FTP folder to another. We could have done that through any number of other simpler methods. So, but we're starting small, and we're going to work our way up to something a bit more complicated, and hopefully that will show you how you can chain these things to make complex scenarios. So in this case, I'm going to add a second destination, which I've already done here. So this destination happens to be a service bus queue, which is an Azure queue that's similar to an Amazon queue. So if I pull up Azure in the dashboard, I can see that there's this service bus section where I've already created a service bus which contains a queue called Q2. I can see that from my previous testing, this queue length is 3. That means there's 3 messages that are in there that have not been read. So I've added an endpoint to that queue, and I've added a rule that if the message type is 1, it will route it to that service bus. So now if I go back to my FTP server, I take message type 1, I'm going to drop that into the FTP folder, and in this case it's not going to move it to this folder, this is the old file, but it's going to route it to the service bus when that runs. So I added the second destination. I'm routing the message based on type, based on a type parameter. Some screenshots of how those rules are set up. We talked about managing the Azure BizTalk services via PowerShell. We've taken a look at the updated bridge. Okay, so I can see that with my my new routing rule that it has routed the message to the queue. My queue size has increased. So now I have a BizTalk service running on Azure that can route messages based on type. A simple example, but you can see how that can be extended and bridges can be connected together to build very complex scenarios, hopefully. Okay then, so let's see. So there's a sample code that's available to call the BizTalk service directly. Running out of time to show a demo of that here, but that's useful for sending messages directly to the bridge rather than have them pulled through FTP. And in summary, we've created a BizTalk service, we've hosted it in the cloud, we created a simple bridge to route messages from an incoming FTP server to the output server. We reviewed some of the PowerShell commands for managing the service. We extended our service to route to we extended our BizTalk application to route messages to a service bus based on the type. And we showed how we can call the bridge endpoint directly using some of the sample code that's available from Microsoft's solution sites. And also, we took a quick look at how to troubleshoot service problems through the Microsoft BizTalk tracking screen, which again, troubleshooting is important. So we'll take another quick look at that. And I can see how through the management porthole, it will show a list of the different messages and any errors, and I can drill into these messages to get more details. Like so. So on that note, I hope that you see how BizTalk can be used to create, from simple applications, I hope you can see how it can be used to create complex enterprise application integration scenarios and how you might use BizTalk in the cloud to implement EAI for your organization. Thank you.